no one of you design products. You all design something else. You design maybe with the fourth dimension.
We sold a ton of products.
No, it's not a final product. It's not something that we can buy. It's not this bottle or this chair. So what you are prototyping at the end, which is like that force that enables to the product to change and to like unfold the capacity of that product, of the object that we're prototyping. So no of you design like a final product to sell. Maybe it is, but it's the impact of the thing that it's the energy in between. Like for you, Alastair, it's not a house. It's more like a political position. No? What do you say?
One of the things I say a lot, so I apologise for those who've heard me say it before, is that every time anybody offers you a vision of the future, the first thing you should ask them to say is, a nice future, who owns it? And we don't talk about the word ownership enough, and we don't ask what is owned in this future, right? Because this is, the technology in itself, is not the thing, right? And so right now, to pick an obvious, easy example, we have Elon Musk working on magic wizard hats that read your brain. And we have Facebook working on magic wizard hats that read your brain. And there's going to be a race. And there's a really interesting question, because my suspicion is that they have two very different ideas about what is owned in that model. And one's going to be turning ownership into a form of capital. So what technology almost always seems to do by default is it changes the parameters of what is owned. Like in the 20th century, we used to own the means of production. And now capital will say, hey, you know what, we don't need to own that anymore, we'll own something else. But let's not be foolish, capital just moves, it tries to find itself an economic end-seeking position. So one of the things that we have to do every time we're developing a piece of technology or anything is at the same time, in parallel, think about what is the civic framework around that technology and what should and shouldn't be owned in that environment. And that's where you get into, as Prima was saying, you get into legal design. And it doesn't matter where you start, you always find legals waiting for you at the end of the corridor.
There's also some of the frustrations we've been having with a few people. There's the challenge of starting to say, well, we need to stop thinking of objects and products perhaps and start thinking of more like platforms or meta infrastructure to create products, right? And that kind of misses the point in which we're still going to need the production of products. And there's no, I don't think that we should start establishing a differentiation between, or a hierarchical differentiation, I guess, between the platforms and the players in gaming, I guess. We need to kind of create a kind of a symbiosis between those. Both would be changing roles constantly. That's happening a lot with the gaming world. The modding communities are actually kind of starting the new versions of the game. The players become the developers, and they kind of, there's kind of a very fluid system. We really suggest that a better way of thinking of products is the platform model. We seem to kind of start relegating the designers, the kind of the actual object designers that are getting the insight to create a platform potentially, as someone that just, maybe has this value. And I think that that's also kind of, I would be dangerously kind of advocating for creating that distinction, that there's kind of a clear cut and we should move in that direction.
The difficulty with presentations like all the ones that we've had in this panel is you have this system and you imagine there's a system here and then there's a system that we're currently in and some magical way we get from one place to the other. And if only everybody made sense, then eventually your grandmother would be able to do the proof of work necessary to get into the open ledger, whatever. And that's not, it's not something that we can act on right now. It's just a way of thinking about what could the structure be going forward. And I think there are a lot of stories to be told along the way, stories that help you delineate between promise and practice, and stories that help you explore what the current infrastructure is. So if you take something like Bunny Huang's Novena laptop, the only reason that he was able to do that is because Gordon Moore's law that this conference is partially patterned on is dead. It's not true. The number of transistors on a chip isn't doubling anymore every year. And because of that, you can take a relatively old processor and take much longer, one person working for 5 years to develop a laptop and releasing a totally open source laptop as opposed to 6 months for Asus or Intel to develop a new laptop and then bring it to market. And so if those product cycles are retarded, then that allows for innovation by much smaller teams. And so the laptop, Bunny's laptop, it's still not totally the laptop that's the solution for everyone. you're not going to be using it as your personal laptop. But it is almost an investigative journalism project into demonstrating that the capabilities that we now have for fabrication for something as complex as a laptop are actually within the reach of individuals.
Yeah, to the point really, like who actually owns the important components, right, that actually represents the competitive advantage. And I think that it's really important on the one hand to have the means of production, but also to understand like how those means of production are being controlled and managed. And so if you look at, for instance, the case of the internet, so everybody eventually gets potentially the ability to create and to communicate. But if we look at how we actually communicate today, we're all going through decentralized platforms. If we look at Uber, it's the same thing. Uber does not own any car. It's the individuals that own the car, but somehow the whole organizational structure, the whole management of those individuals comes through decentralized platforms, to the network, the platform by which people are interacting with each other is centralized, which is the problem. So I think the really powerful thing of the fab13 network is actually to identify how we actually give back to the people the means of production, the knowledge about how to use those means of production, then all the access to the design, which actually to be free, and then to understand how we can actually design at the higher level, at the meta level, those governance structure that actually enable people to interact with all those raw material, to interact through a platform that remains an open platform.
I want to say something that we can probably say, I want to change the world where I start from. And also trying to go away from, I usually, I get, sometimes we get into panic because people come to us and say, I want to, they feel like we have a solution for everything. In a fab lab, you can make almost anything. They really believe it. People come and knock their door and say, you can solve anything. But I see the potential of the, going from, starting to be from Thomas, designing those interventions in when we can start to make something, right? And thinking about how fab labs are the mediators between, that high-level meta design and kind of how I go outside of the lab and I start to prototype how things could work differently. Small, really small, but with the potential of connecting globally. So I think that's where somehow you start to, nurture things. Instead of going to the Elon Musk kind of thing, I'm going to try to solve one thing at a time. I'm going to solve it, and that's it. So, what do you think about it? What about the role of, coming back to the prototyping, but also prototyping with reality, in the lab, understanding like, the street next to you or in front of your lab is part of your lab. The next block is part of your lab, and so on and so on. Any reaction?
I think on the question of prototyping, I think actually one thing that I find amazing about fab labs is that on the one hand you're prototyping new products, new materials, new objects, but you're also prototyping new social construction. Right? So there's this whole mentality and ideology around fab labs, which is actually about collaboration, about organizing people around a common objective. And this is not a form of prototyping, but it's more on the level of the social structure, the social testing. And I think this is really interesting to look how those realities that somehow works, or more or less works in a local fab lab, can actually be exported in the same way as we can export the tools that we develop and the material that comes up. We can also try and export the organization and the community building that is done within a fab lab.
I would like to spend questions from the audience. I don't know if anyone has a question to panelists. No one? Let's stand up and say louder. Yeah.